The sun rose gently over the rugged terrain of Ohio's wilderness, casting amber light across the rocky landscape. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video. Two lifelong friends, Brody and Mike, paused mid-hike, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. Their boots crunched on gravel as they examined the steep, uninviting cliff ahead. For most, the jagged ascent would have been a deterrent, a warning sign to turn back. But for these two adventurers, it was a call to action. They began the climb with practiced precision, digging their fingers into the cool, rough grooves of the rock face. Wind whispered across the mountainside as they moved upward, silent but synchronized, like a team that had done this countless times before. The climb wasn't easy, but neither of them expected what lay halfway up the cliff, something entirely out of place. Brody spotted at first a set of lines carved into the rock, perfectly straight, too deliberate to be natural. He leaned in, brushing away dust with gloved fingers. "Mike, look at this," he called quietly. Mike clambered over, skepticism written across his face. But when he saw the etchings, his expression shifted to confusion. "That's not from erosion," he murmured. "These are man-made." Their curiosity now ignited, the two deviated from their original path, navigating toward a narrow ledge where the lines seemed to converge. There it was, a perfectly smooth surface embedded into the cliffside. Not just stone, but a doorway, hidden in plain sight. "Think we can open it?" Brody asked. Without waiting for an answer, he began rigging a makeshift pulley system using their climbing gear. Ropes tightened, metal bits secured into the rock, and muscles strained. With a final heave, the concealed stone door groaned and shifted, revealing a gaping void beyond. A deep, damp gust of air whooshed from the newly opened passage, carrying with it a scent that made both men recoil rotten eggs. Brody grimaced. "Sulfur," Mike said, pinching his nose. "Could mean explosives. Whoever built this." They weren't messing around. Despite the warning signs, neither of them hesitated. Their hike was forgotten. Ahead lay a tunnel, man-made and soaked in mystery. Flashlights on, they stepped inside. The transition from sunlit wilderness to the dark, damp corridor was jarring. The tunnel was tight and humid, and, the deeper they went, the colder it got. Water dripped from the ceiling, and their footsteps echoed eerily through the silence. Then came the sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A high-pitched whine, like metal scraping against stone. They stopped, flashlights flicking nervously toward the sound. Then it happened again, louder this time, and followed by whistling, cheerful, human. They froze. No longer alone, they killed their lights and flattened against the damp walls. A faint glow approached the flickering flame of an old oil lantern. A figure emerged, hunched and slow. An old man, bearded and weathered, muttering softly to himself. He didn't see them as he passed, focused on the tools laid neatly against the wall. Shovels, pickaxes, drills. Some were rusted, ancient, but others pristine, barely used. Brody's mind raced. "Someone's still working down here," he whispered. "This isn't abandoned." They followed the man deeper into the mountain, guided only by the flicker of his lantern. Eventually, they entered a massive chamber. The ceiling soared above them. Lanterns dotted the space, casting dancing shadows over hulking metal machines. The man raised his pickaxe and began pounding into the stone with rhythmic, practiced swings. Then he stopped. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a jagged golden nugget. Mike's eyes widened. "Is that gold?" They didn't have time to wonder. The man turned suddenly, moving toward the furnace they had crouched behind. Flames roared to life, and heat surged through the metal, burning their skin. They cried out, unable to bear the pain, and instantly gave away their hiding spot. The man spun, startled, weapon raised. "Who are you? You trying to steal my sparkle?" he barked, gripping the pickaxe. Brody raised his hand. "No, no! We didn't know anyone was here. We found the Dorjest hikers, I swear." The man squinted at them through the flickering light, his shoulders tense. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, he lowered the tool. "My name's Bob," he said, "and you're lucky I didn't take your heads off." Brody and Mike exchanged a glance. Bob's face was cracked with age, his clothes tattered, his eyes sunken. He looked like he hadn't been above ground in years. As they followed him deeper into the tunnels, he began to talk. How he'd stumbled on the gold back in the 80s. How he'd built this entire labyrinth of caves, mining it by hand and sometimes with dynamite. How he called the treasure his sparkle. Bob lived in total isolation. He hadn't seen another human face in years. Everything he'd built, everything he owned, was buried in this mountain. And then they saw it. A room so vast it echoed, and in its center a mound of gold so large it looked fake. Nuggets stacked chest high. Mike gasped. This is worth millions." But Brody noticed something else. Bob wasn't smiling. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. The years of digging, the solitude, the obsession it had all taken a toll. He was surrounded by unimaginable wealth, and yet completely alone. Brody stepped forward gently. "You don't have to stay here, Bob. We can help you. This gold, it can change your life. Bob's story made headlines in the local news, The Man Who Lived Inside a Mountain of Gold. Reporters were intrigued by the mystery of an off-grid miner and the two hikers who helped change his life. Brody and Mike were offered interviews, book deals, even documentaries, but they respectfully declined most of the attention. They knew the real story wasn't just about treasure. It was about reclaiming a life lost to obsession. For Bob, adjusting to the outside world wasn't simple. The rush of cities, technology, and people after 4 decades of silence was overwhelming. At first, he'd freeze at the sound of a car honk or flinch when someone approached too quickly. But with Brody and Mike's support, he learned to ease into the rhythm of modern life. They helped him open a bank account, get legal advice for the gold sale, and even brought him to a doctor for a full checkup. Surprisingly, Bob was in fairly good health, physically hardened by years of mountain labor, though mentally burdened by loneliness. Brody encouraged Bob to consider therapy not because he was broken, but because carrying decades of silence is something no man should bear alone. Bob agreed, albeit reluctantly. Over time, the sessions helped. He started talking more, smiling more, even laughing at times. He shared stories of winters spent snowed in with only squirrels and birds for company, and about nights when he dreamed of a world he thought he could never return to. Mike, ever the optimist, took Bob out for his first ride on a roller coaster. Bob screamed, the whole way half in terror, half in exhilaration, but got off grinning. It was his first brush with childhood wonder in decades. As months passed, Bob used a small portion of his wealth to purchase a cozy cottage at the edge of a forest, where he could still hear birds in the morning and breathe mountain air without being buried in it. He kept one of his old oil lanterns on the mantelpiece, a symbol of his past, but also of how far he'd come. The rest of the money? Bob set up a trust fund for children in need. He named it the Sparkle Foundation. Let them have their own kind of sparkle, he said during the quiet launch ceremony, attended only by Brody, Mike, and the few locals he'd come to trust. The hikers, meanwhile, continued their adventures, though none quite as surreal as the day they unearthed a hidden tunnel behind a sealed rock. They started a small blog to document their travels, paths less taken, and once in a while they'd include subtle nods to Bob's tale, though never revealing too much. It was his story to tell, if he ever wanted to, and he did, in his own time. Years later, a book appeared in local bookstores. Buried Alive by Gold, My Life Inside the Mountain by Bob Ellery. It became an unexpected bestseller. Readers were moved by Bob's honesty, his strange solitude, and his eventual redemption. In a television interview promoting the book, Bob looked into the camera and said, I spent most of my life thinking gold would fill the hole inside me, but it wasn't until I met 2 strangers, Brody and Mike, that I realized the only treasure that matters is the people who care enough to pull you out of the darkness. The host, visibly moved, thanked Bob for sharing his journey. The broadcast ended with a shot of Bob standing in front of a school playground he'd funded. Children ran around joyfully behind him, their laughter echoing across the field. Brody and Mike watched from their apartment, sipping tea and smiling. They knew they had changed someone's life, but they never expected how much that person would change theirs in return. And though they would go on to hike countless more peaks, nothing ever quite matched the day a simple climb turned into a discovery that revealed not just a secret tunnel, but a forgotten soul, a buried fortune, and a lesson about humanity that no treasure could ever buy. As the seasons changed, so did Bob. While he remained a humble and quiet figure in the eyes of the public, those close to him witnessed an inspiring transformation. He began giving talks at local community centers, sharing lessons from a life buried literally and emotionally. His words didn't come from polished speeches, but from raw experience, and that authenticity resonated. I used to think silence was peace, he told a small group of teens on the brink of dropping out of school. But silence without purpose becomes a prison. You have to hear yourself think, but you also need someone else to hear you too. His words hit home for many, especially kids who felt invisible. Some would hang back after the sessions just to ask, did you really live alone that long? Or weren't you scared? Bob never sugarcoated his answers. Yes, he'd say, some nights I thought I was going mad. Other nights I was sure I already had. But more importantly, Bob emphasized the hope, that it wasn't too late to return, that you could always find your way back from a dark place, even one sealed behind a mountain wall. Meanwhile, Brody and Mike had turned their blog into a full-fledged platform. They invited other adventurers, survivalists, and even urban explorers to contribute. Paths Less Taken had become a quiet success, garnering a loyal following of people disillusioned with the ordinary. In every post, they wove a thread of meaning, encouraging readers to look beyond the physical journey and find the story within it. One entry in particular stood out. It was titled, The Man in the Mountain Never Left Us. They didn't mention Bob by name, but the piece was a beautifully written tribute to people who vanish from society, not because they're running from crime or fame, but because they're lost in plain sight. The comment section flooded with confessions from people who had relatives like Bob. war veterans who refused to come home, women who disappeared into the silence of grief, or young adults who locked themselves away from life's chaos. The story had sparked something. A dialogue. A movement even. Letters began arriving at Bob's cottage, hundreds of them. Some were from old friends who thought he had died. Others were from strangers who simply wanted to say thank you. A woman in Nebraska wrote, "You gave my son hope. He started talking to us again. I don't know what changed, but I think it was your story." Bob kept every single letter in a wooden chest near the fireplace. He would open it at night and read a few, often with tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. Not out of sorrow, but out of gratitude for a second chance he never saw coming. Yet for all the newfound attention and purpose, Bob never stopped being Bob. He still took long walks through the woods at dawn. He still collected rainwater out of habit, though now he had running tap. And he still lit his old oil lantern on quiet nights, letting its flicker remind him of where he came from. One spring morning, a knock echoed at Bob's door. Standing there was a teenage boy, no more than 17, holding a crumpled notebook. His name was Lucas, and he'd hitchhiked hundreds of miles after reading Bob's book. He was quiet, nervous, and haunted behind the eyes. Bob invited him in without hesitation. Over the following weeks, Lucas stayed in the guest room. He helped with gardening, listened more than he spoke, and slowly began to open up. His story was one of pain abuse, neglect, the feeling of being invisible. But through Bob's quiet kindness and the comforting silence of the forest, Lucas began to heal. Bob saw himself in the boy. Not the miner buried in gold, but the broken man who once believed no one cared. And this time, Bob didn't wait 40 years to act. He connected Lucas with a therapist, helped him apply for school. Even went with him to buy his first guitar after Lucas mentioned he used to write songs before things got bad. The day Lucas left, he hugged Bob tightly. "I thought I came here to run away," he said. "But you helped me realize I came here to remember who I was before everything went wrong." Bob just smiled. "Then I guess that makes two of us." Brody and Mike, still hiking new trails and exploring new corners of the world, kept in touch regularly. Sometimes they'd all meet up, just the three of them, for quiet evenings where few words were spoken but everything was understood. During one such evening, as they watched the sun dip behind the horizon, Brody turned to Bob and said, "What you ever miss the mountain?" Bob took a moment. "Sometimes, but only the quiet, not the loneliness." And with that, they sat in silence. 3 lives forever linked by one fateful decision to turn back, to look behind the wall, to save someone who the world had already forgotten. Because in the end, the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was the man who had finally found his way back. Months passed, and the story of the man in the mountain quietly faded from media headlines. But in the hearts of those he touched, Bob remained a living legend, not for his past, but for the courage it took to step into the world again. He continued to write not books for shelves, but long-hand letters to people who needed them. Sometimes he mailed them. Sometimes he just kept them in a drawer, convinced the act of writing was healing enough for both parties. Each morning he'd sit by the window of his modest home, sipping tea, watching the wind play with the trees. He didn't need much anymore. After a lifetime of isolation, his definition of wealth had shifted. It wasn't in precious metals or quiet cave-sit, was in human connection, in shared meals, in simple mornings where no one was forgotten. One rainy afternoon, he received a phone call, something still rare for him. It was from Lucas, now studying psychology at a community college. He had made new friends, joined a band, and was even planning a podcast to talk about mental health and survival stories. "You're going to be my first guest," Lucas said. Bob chuckled. "Only if you promise not to edit out my old man rambling." "I wouldn't dream of it," Lucas replied. That call left Bob smiling for days.